Well, we're in our study. Does that help? Maybe. We're in our study of Genesis. We're in chapter 2 and verses 23 through 25. But we are going to be, since our speaker last week decided to take one of my verses, I'm going to go backwards just a little bit. They're all interconnected, so I think it's fine. But I do want to just kind of refresh your memory about the creation of woman as we talk about husbands and wives as one flesh. What do you think of when you think of one? Think of the number one. As an old motorcycle rider, you think of, at least I used to dream of holding the number one plate at least in Southern California for the American Motorcycle Association. Never got there, but that's what I dreamed of. I had a friend down the street who was the number one desert rider. He got to carry in desert events and the number one plate. So he's number one, right, for that year. And you might think of a sporting event or something when somebody wins a big game, hey, we're number one, right? Or you might think of a number one, which sometimes leads to number two, but Three Dog Night, one is the loneliest number when his girlfriend left her, right? He's all alone. And I want to remind you that one is an odd number. Some people can ride safely on one wheel and even do tricks. And Pat Boone in 1957, June 12th, this was the number one popular song of Pat Boone, Love Letters in the Sand. And it's not the same one that we've heard religiously. I think maybe there's something like that, Love Letters. Or at least that's a phrase, I think, in one of the songs. But Pat Boone was rocking it. I thought about playing it, but it was pretty hokey. In the movie All of Me, I'm not sure that's the right clip I wanted, so let's try it. But the movie All of Me, Steve Martin and Lily Tomlin portray these characters. Lily Tomlin is a really rich woman who's dying, and she's really grouchy all the time, and nobody likes her. And she's found this person from Middle Eastern philosophy that could take her spirit and put it into a young, vibrant body woman. And that's the plan, but it ends up that she enters Steve Martin at the same time. And so if you haven't seen the movie, that's sort of the gist of it. And I hope this is the right clip. Yeah. Let's see.
Excuse me, this is a private conversation. Do you mind?
No! Please, just do as I say.
Oh!
You seem to have control over the left side of your body, while I feel dominant on the right. Oh, let go of that.
So before we get here, it's kind of a humorous clip, but in fact, the guy bragged that it was the funniest clip ever, but I don't know if it's that. But I want us to think about, in reality, is that the way some of our relationships are, where one is trying to lead this way and the other one is fighting against it to lead that way, and they are going in opposite directions. And the whole design of marriage and the husband and wife becoming one flesh is also to go in one direction and to go with one purpose and one spirit and one mindset. We don't always, as husbands and wives, make the right choice on which direction to go. But the idea is that you work together in harmony and teamwork so that the direction you've chosen, you've been hopefully praying about the direction, so it's God's leading you in that direction. But that's the whole idea. And I just want us to think about the struggle that sometimes happens when one person wants to lead, one person doesn't want to follow, and vice versa. Because it happens sometimes where the woman has really, occasionally has really good suggestions. And so sometimes we as men need to humble ourselves and take that direction. And that's 99% of the time in my household. She's a lot smarter, as someone said a moment ago. So we're going to talk about becoming one in marriage. And the marriage unit is just like the Godhead unit. It's similar. Jesus said, I and the Father are one, John 10, verse 30. The Message version of that says, I and the Father are of one heart and one mind. So individual persons making unified decisions. So let's notice how Adam and Eve become one. Genesis 2:23-25, the man said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She should be called woman, for she was taken out of man. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. When we get to Genesis chapter 6, we're going to learn that God told Noah, you're to bring into the ark 2 of every living creature, male and female. Keep them alive with you. That's Genesis 6:19. God initially made everything male and female when he made animals, when he made birds, when he made fish, so they could reproduce and create more of the same kind, like kind. And so in order to complete man, since Adam is a singular, and there's no other man, there's no other human creature on the earth, face of the earth, he's all by himself, God is going to make a helper suitable for him. Genesis chapter 2, verse 18. And this is really an important concept. In the Hebrew, it's Ezer Kenegdo, and it means a helper like him or corresponding to him. Somebody who is perfect, a perfect fit for man to make him capable of reproduction and ruling. Before we get into this in Genesis 2, though, I'd like to kind of take a sidestep, and I'm a little nervous about it because Paul, when I go to Paul's writing, he sort of grates against people. And I'm hoping that I make it clear enough where you say, okay, yeah, that's cool. But it can sound, wait a minute, is that really what he's saying? So that's where I want us to go. So I'm in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. I'd like to go there. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And I'm in verse 2. I'm going to read down through verse 9. So this is Paul writing, not Carney. I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions just as I pass them on to you. But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of woman is man. And the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. Now, this is a familiar passage when people are want to preach about women aren't to cut their hair. We can have a discussion of that, but I'd like to save that for later if you're interested in that particular discussion. What I want you to think in this passage, because it's weird, he talks about the glory of God and the reflection of God and the woman of the man. But then he inserts this head covering and stuff. It's sort of a strange passage here. Man is the reflection of the glory of God, uniquely created to bear the image of God as ruler. In that sense, he's created to be God's glory. And he's a sovereign ruler, God is. And man was created and given dominion over the earth and over the created world to care for creation according to God's plan. So we're a reciprocal of God, so it's passing through us. And it's true that both men and women are created in God's image. Genesis 1:27 alludes to that. But it's man who is created from the dust of the ground and woman created from the side of man. And we're going to go into that in a little more detail in just a bit. The male was given authority over God's created world, and by that fact is the reflected glory of God. The fall didn't change that. After Genesis 3, we're going to learn that the woman is still going to desire for her husband, but he will rule over you. So she's going to have this change of heart and going to want to make the decisions now. And at the fall, we know it wasn't just the woman, because the man was stupid enough to go along with the woman's suggestion. But she said, let's follow the serpent's, wishes, and let's eat. And the husband, of course, following, did that exact same thing. So man is the glory of God because he's given headship. Woman is described as the glory of man. Man was made to manifest God's authority. Woman was made to manifest man's authority. The woman carries out the man's will as the man carries out God's will. And so she comes along to help man, and we're going to look at that again in just a moment. Haven't named the enemies yet. Okay, good. At least you didn't immediately say yes. So here's a thought question. What disadvantages does a woman have if she is only the reflection of her husband? If you got a deadbeat husband, that's not a very good thing, right? But if you got a husband that is the glory of God and honoring God and doing what God wants him to do, what disadvantages are there? And what advantages does the woman have in that situation? I think the point is that God can make a magnificent creature out of the dust to reflect his glory. And he can also make a magnificent creature out of the side of man to be a helper for him and to radiate man's glory, which is just an extension of God's glory. And the Apostle Paul goes back to creation. He says, for man did not come from woman, but woman from man. That's verse 9 of 1 Corinthians 11 there. She is intellectually, morally, spiritually equal, and probably in most cases superior to man. She is unique. Her role resides under the leadership, protection, and care of man, and she is to be a helper suitable for him. And that's what the scripture's saying there, that she was created for man's sake. Now, each role has its challenges. If you women think, oh, the husband's got it made, he's the glory of God, and he gets to make all the decisions, you know what? My desire is for her to make all the decisions. And in fact, she gets frustrated when I say, I don't care what, let's do what you want to do. I don't like making decisions. And sometimes it's difficult, it's hard for the man to say, here's where we gotta go. And it's hard, the challenge on the women's side is listening to that guy over there who isn't always trustworthy and doesn't always make the right decisions and isn't always on top of things. And I follow him. And with ease and with graciousness and with love. And so there's challenges on both sides, isn't there? Well, let's go back to Genesis 2. And let's look at that in a little more detail there. So in Genesis chapter 2, which is where our passage is taken today, it's interesting that out of the ground, God formed every animal and bird and brought them to Adam. And out of the ground, God is going to take and form a man. But it's super interesting to me that The woman is not formed that way. And, I mean, we can have discussions about that, but the woman is taking used parts, and God is building a new woman out of parts from the guy. And it's just strange to me. Obviously, when the animals were created, they're out of dirt, they're out of dust, they're out of the atomic energy that is in the earth, all the physical material makeup of the dirt. He brings these creatures to life, the fish, the birds, the animals, and he's going to bring them to Adam, and he's going to have him name them. He brings these animals, brings the birds. He doesn't bring the fish because that would be kind of hard on the fish to flop up there and go past Adam. Where you picture that one? Okay. But Adam's going to name them. Bob, George, Matilda, elephant, rhinoceros, chickadee, all these different names I guess he comes up with. God creates the animals, the same chemical material. He creates the human, man, and I kind of think this is why boys are always stinky and dirty, is because they're going back to their origin. But by his power, God would gather and bring the animals to Adam. He does it again in Genesis 6 after the fall when he brings them all for the ark. But he brings them before Adam, who is intelligent and intellectually sound, only a few hours old. On that sixth day, God created him. So he's not very old, but he's mature and he knows what's going on. His mind has never been corrupted by sin. Can you imagine how clear you could think and decisions you could come up with quickly, and you could name things easily if your mind was not corrupted by sin, by struggle, by temptation? Adam had the capacity to look at these creatures and determine some characteristic about them and give them each a name. And I don't think it's the idea that God specifically wanted a name for each animal. God probably already had names for them in his mind. But what he's doing is he's setting the scene for the creation of woman. He's setting Adam up for this creation. And so he's given Adam an object lesson when all these animals went by, two by two, and he's recognizing each characteristic about them, what their texture is like, what colors they are. And one of the things he's going to note about these animals is that they're in pairs, and none of them look like him. Even though they were all created from the dust of the earth, none of them look like him. And so the animals came by, he names them, doesn't give them the Latin name that you find in the encyclopedia, but he recognizes the design and that they come in pairs, and he understands there's no match for him. There's no true kinship between man and animals. I get the fact that you like your pets, and you have lambs and goats and dogs and cats and snakes and whatever. And so there is some sense of kinship there, but it's not the same, is it? It's not the human connection, the human fellowship, the human intimate companionship. No animal can provide that. And Adam comes to the conclusion that in all creation, he alone was alone. There was no one suitable to come alongside him, to be with him, to help him be fruitful and fill the earth. And since there's no creature capable in relationship to man, God is going to make one. And so he causes a deep sleep to fall on that first man. We talked about surgeries this week. Along with each surgery is an anesthesiologist, whatever they are. And they give you medicine or drip medicine into you that makes you conk out, makes you go to sleep. I remember when I was young, I had to get put under, and I remember they would cover your face with and pump ether gas, which I think is poisonous. And they've come to that conclusion that we shouldn't be using that. And so now they use other things, but I remember maybe that's part of my problem. But I remember having that done, and God is the original one. He's the original surgeon. He puts Adam to sleep, into a deep sleep, so he's not going to feel a thing, right? And God operates. The the New American Standard says he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh in that place. So God put Adam out, took his divine scalpel, cut Adam open, removed what was needed, then closed up the flesh. By the way, the Hebrew word for ribs isn't really clear enough. When you think of rib, when you think of rib, this is the Hebrew word tesela. You might just think of the bone, right? It's also including the marrow and what's inside, but it's also translated 35 times in the Old Testament, and this is the only place it's translated rib. What it's talking about in the other places is side, so that's probably a better translation. So he took a rib, but also took flesh, and the material of flesh to form the woman. And so he literally put Adam into a deep sleep, slit open the side. By the way, in case you're wondering, men and women have identical number of ribs. Doesn't say God took out a rib. In fact, verse 23 says, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." So when when God did the surgery, he didn't just take bone, he took flesh, took the DNA out of Adam. Isn't that weird? The first married couple is related. I mean, this would go over well in the southern states of some sort, but same DNA, same flesh. So it's not just limited to a rib. God took out some bone, took out some flesh, part of man's side, made a woman, closed it back up. And so the woman was created with material from the man. So in connection, she's back to the earth as well. Remember, Genesis 1:27 says she was made in the image of God. So she had all the same characteristics, the same cognition, the same spirituality, the same personality, same relationships, same emotions, same creativity. The woman was created from the man because she was formed for an inseparable unity and fellowship of life with that man. And all that the image of God gives to man, he also gave to woman. Only difference, God made Adam out of dirt, Eve out of Adam. Now the word made is also interesting, the second word there, kana. And it's used about 300 times in the Old Testament, and it's translated build most of the time. And here it says made, at least my translation, but it's really talking about how God built a woman out of these parts. He took these parts and formed them into a woman. And the similarities and the differences. And the same term is used of the builder who takes stone and wood to build some beautiful edifice of some sort. That's the concept. So God took these parts and built this woman, a perfect match for the man. He fashioned the most beautiful of all creatures. No one would argue that. He fashioned woman with all the loveliness, with all the beauty, with all the grace that a man could never imagine, and probably never has imagined, because they don't have it. So he brought her to the man in all her perfection. Now Eve, we know her name in chapter 3, verse 20. He calls her Eve for the first time. Really, she was just woman at first, but reminds me of Perry Allen when he used to call Charlene the wife. Yeah, the wife and I, and she could be standing like right next to him, but woman, come on, woman, get over here, right? So Eve is going to be as mature as Adam, with full intelligence yet without sin. She's going to be capable of all kinds of pure thoughts and actions and motives, and how clear she's going to be thinking, how smart she is, all those kinds of things, right? And Adam is wondering after this parade, all-day parade of creatures who had partners, and he's come to the conclusion that none are suitable. None would match up with him to be fruitful and fill the earth. And God sets him up on this successful blind date as he puts him to sleep and opens him up. And now we get to our passage actually in chapter 2, verse 23. The man said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." The phrase here, "this is now," does not do this passage justice. It's really, finally, this joyous astonishment. Here's someone that I can relate to. Here's a match for me. No longer elephants and rhinoceros and birds and all these kinds of things, but someone who looks like me, who will fit me and who will help me and who will work with me and who will be my everlasting companion. And so he's excited about this. This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. And he's overwhelmed. And so he writes a poem or a song, a love song. This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She should be called woman, for she was taken out of man. That phrase became a common expression to speak of family relations. In fact, Jewish society, they still use this idea. You are now my own flesh and blood. Maybe you've heard that, even if you're not Jewish. But Genesis 29, verse 14, Laban said to Jacob, "You are my own flesh and blood." In Judges 9, verse 2, Abimelech said, "Ask all the citizens of Shechem, which is better for you, to have all 70 of Jerubbaal's sons rule over you, or just one man? Remember, I am your flesh and blood." And so Adam identifies who she was. She's his family. A perfect fit, a perfect family, even though there's just two there, right? This is good. And she's going to be called woman. Now in the Hebrew, Ish is the man. And you would think that these were related with the same root word, but they're really not, even though they sound alike. But the woman is Isha, and it does mean woman. But if you dig really deep into this, the root really means soft. And that's what Adam's saying. Oh, she's soft. Oh, that's beautiful. Finally, someone that I can relate to, and someone who's soft, and someone who is gracious, and it's amazing. And so his first impression was she's soft. And I imagine that some drool was involved as well. And this is God's design. And if you know what the perfect woman was like, she was soft. And so you who are soft, you ladies, be thankful. And us men, rejoice that you're soft. So Adam has now the perfect partner. He's written a poem to that woman. But the Creator completes the thought in verse 24, where he says, "That is why man leaves father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh." Well, my question is, how could Adam and Eve leave father and mother and be able to unite together? So that's a thought for you to think about. This established, this woman and man coming together and being united as one, establishes the foundation for humanity, but also for marriage and also for sexual conduct. God recognizes only one kind of sexual behavior in the human realm, and that's between a man and a woman who have left father and mother and who cleave to each other as one flesh. And that's really the only context that God has ordained. The Jewish leaders came to Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew and said, "Look, Moses allowed for divorce." And notice Jesus' response in chapter 19, verse 4. Let's read over there. So Matthew 19, verse 4, and a couple other verses too. Haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate. Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. So that's a whole other topic as well, right? But the idea is that they separate from father and mother and are united together. And they join together and they become one flesh for life. And that's God's intent. That's God's ideal. Now notice back in Genesis the interesting follow-up to that, with God still speaking. Moses speaking, I guess Moses is writing this, but Adam and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. Adam and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. Isn't that a TV show on one of those channels, Naked and Unashamed? Or is it something like that? I've never watched it. But I remember we were down at Marcia's sister's house one Thanksgiving, I believe it was, and her son, Garrett, who was probably about 3 or 4 at the most, came out in all his glory. He had his cowboy hat, his cowboy boots, his holster and gun, and that was it. And he came out flying with bullets flying, blazing. Not ashamed. He didn't care. He could care less that he was buck naked, right? And that's how Adam and Eve, not that they dressed up in cowboy suits, but none of the animals had clothes on. Why should they, right? They were unashamed. They were just there. They were in the created form. They weren't ashamed. They didn't know sexual desire could be perverted and twisted. They didn't have any wicked thoughts running around their imaginations. They didn't know evil existed. Shame is produced by the consciousness of evil that may exist in a thing. And we feel shame in our lives as sinners because we have evil desires. And these didn't exist. And there was beauty in the shameless wonder of the original marriage. God brought them together and they enjoyed a full joy of that relationship. They had no capacity to feel shame. But how sad when you think about the fall, and we'll talk just in a second about that, but how it produces sin and took the pristine and pure, sinless environment, the shameless joy of that union corrupts it by bringing into thoughts of evil that cause shame. Adam and Eve had the kind of union God designed as the pinnacle. Peter says this, he says, the same goes for you, husbands. Be good husbands to your wives. Honor them, delight in them. As women, they lack some of your advantages, but in the new life of God's grace, you are equals. Treat your wives then as equals, so your prayers don't run aground. That's 1 Peter 3:7, according to the Message paraphrase. One man, one woman, leaving parents, cleaving together in a strong bond of life, becoming one flesh. And it's interesting that children are now going to be born to Adam and Eve, and that is going to be some of Adam and some of Eve joining together to become a new human, a brand new human. So sometimes we get corrupted. I know there are some that have the gift of singleness and they can be single the rest of their lives. Linwood Smith had that. I don't know if it was because he was cranky all the time or because he chose that. But he stayed single. There's people that have that gift, that ability, but they're the exception. I think God's design is for people, humans, to have a relationship with one another. And sometimes we have, as a society, have gone way beyond that Adam and Eve type relationship. Committed fornication, adultery. There have been people with homosexual sins, all that brings guilt and brings struggle. But we have to reach out for God's grace, and we find His grace is sufficient. God can heal those relationships. God is a God of grace and forgiveness. You know, immediately after the fall, family relationships get assaulted. Conflict comes, there's polygamy, there's wickedness, there's adultery, homosexuality, fornication, rape, incest, prostitution. In fact, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 16, don't you know that if you have relations with a prostitute, you become one with her? And that's the idea here in marriage. All kinds of things happen. And we can see, if you look into chapter 3 now, we're going to find out that things go downhill quickly. The serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field. And we're going to see the tragic fall of man. That's the lesson. However, I have two bits of application if you're interested. We have two options, so and neither one are graded. So that's awesome. So the first section, just look at that for a second. So here's a way to really get your mind thinking about your mate. And pray for that mate to become one flesh with you. If you're having struggle or having some friction, pray for that mate. Make sure you've left your parents to become one flesh. So you might think about ways that I haven't left my parents and I still rely on them for wisdom and decision making and those kinds of things. Now it's okay to get ideas, but if you're letting your parents make the decision for you and your husband or you and your wife, that's not the way it's supposed to be. And then make sure that you're uniting with your mate to become one flesh. And so think about those three areas. And so you might, as an application of that, you might consider the following, just maybe complete or make a list of things. Ways I have failed to leave my birth family, and ways I have failed to unite to my mate. Now, understand, I don't want you to abandon your birth family and never see them again and never talk to them. That's not the idea here. What is the idea is that you're now, as husband and wife, if you are husband and wife, you're making the decisions with what you got. You might ask for advice, you may get ideas, but you're making the decision. This is your decision to live with, in other words. And this is what God wants you to do. And so you might strategize how to turn those quote-unquote failures around and make them into successes. Okay, so that's the first option. I can send this out too, so you don't have to write all this down if you don't want to. And you don't even have to do this. It's just if you want something to do this week. The second is the application from Ephesians chapter 5, verse 29. And let me get over there, I'll read that to you. By the way, Ephesians 5 is another great passage if you want to look at that and study that about husband and wife and households. But in verse 29 it says, after all, no one ever hated their body, but they feed and care for their body, just as Christ does the church. So the idea of feeding and caring for your mate. And so two Greek words are used there. Paul uses two Greek words. The first one is to feed and nourish. And the second is to consider precious or worth preserving. And so this is what we do to our own bodies. We feed and nourish it. I mean, you don't starve yourself intentionally unless you're on a diet of some sort. So you don't want to do that for the rest of your life because you're going to die, right? So you feed and nourish it. And then you also ought to consider your own body precious and worth preserving. But how does this fit in relation to a mate or a future mate? How are you going to do this? How are you going to build upon this for your future mate? And so you might want to create a couple lists, ways to feed and nourish my partner, and then ways to regard them as precious and worth preserving. And I'm not talking about pickling and preserving. And then choose one from each list and make a 30-day plan. Here's what I'm going to do over the next 30 days, the next 4 weeks even. I'm going to do this week, this week, and so forth. And see what kind of excitement you can drum up, and how your relationship increases with your mate, and how you become more connected and more one in all of life, all the decisions, all the joy, all the happiness, all the fun times of being a family. So there you go. There's an application. Hopefully you'll choose one of them. You're welcome to do both of them if you want extra credit. But that's between you and the Lord. So thanks for listening. Don't want to close a lesson without offering an invitation to make things right. If you're struggling, if you've been doing things wrong, if you're doing things your own way, let's go back to the Creator's way and let's think about Him and how you can honor Him and bring glory to Him and how He helps you through that. If you're not a Christian, never have become a Christian, I challenge you to do so today, to become one with the Lord, to become part of His family and be united with Him. And come believing that Jesus Christ is God's Son, believe that He can take your sins away, and pledge your allegiance to Him and as you confess Him and be immersed to have your sins forgiven. You're going to be joined in that family. And if you've done that and you're struggling with something's on your mind, something's causing you grief, something that's holding you back, there's a great opportunity also. If you want to come forward and we can pray for you, we can also do that afterwards. If you want to talk to one of us afterwards, that'd be just as well. So thank you so much for listening, and let's stand now and we'll have a song.